Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into one of the most controversial questions in Westeros history. When we talk about devastating civil wars in the Seven Kingdoms, everyone immediately thinks of the Dance of Dragons, right? Dragons fighting dragons, the sky raining fire and blood, and the near extinction of those magnificent beasts. But here's the thing, there's another conflict that might have been even more devastating for the realm, and that's the Blackfyre Rebellion. Actually, it wasn't just one rebellion. It was 5 separate uprisings that plagued Westeros for over 60 years. So buckle up, because we're about to explore whether this often overlooked conflict was actually worse than the famous Dance of Dragons. Let me set the stage for you. The year is 184 AC, and King Aegon IV, also known as Aegon the Unworthy, is on his deathbed. This guy was quite possibly the worst king in Targaryen history, which is saying something. He spent his entire reign indulging every vice imaginable, creating political chaos, and fathering more bastards than anyone could count. But his final act would prove to be his most destructive. With his last breath, he legitimized all of his bastard children. Every single one of them. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's generous of him, but here's the problem. Among those bastards was Daemon Waters, a man who possessed everything a king should have. He was charismatic, a legendary warrior, strikingly handsome, with the classic Targaryen features. And he had been given the ancestral Targaryen sword Blackfyre by his father. That sword was supposed to be carried by kings, not bastards. So Daemon took the name Blackfyre for himself and his house. His sigil was the Targaryen dragon, but with the colors reversed, a black dragon on a red field instead of red on black. Pretty bold statement, right? Meanwhile, the legitimate heir to the throne was Daeron, the second of his name. Now, Daeron was actually a good king. He was scholarly, diplomatic, and he achieved something that had eluded Targaryens for over a century. He peacefully brought Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms through marriage alliance. But here's where things get messy. Aegon the Unworthy had spread rumors, probably to torment his son, that Daeron wasn't actually his child. He claimed that Queen Nerys had an affair with her brother, Aemon the Dragon Knight, and that Daeron was their bastard son. Were these rumors true? Probably not. But in politics, the truth doesn't matter as much as what people believe. Let's talk about why the Blackfyre Rebellion happened, because it wasn't just about two brothers fighting over a crown. There were deep, systemic issues festering in Westeros. First, there was massive resentment about Dorne. For hundreds of years, the Seven Kingdoms had been trying to conquer Dorne. Thousands of soldiers had died in those attempts. Then Daeron comes along and just marries a Dornish princess, Mireia Martell, and suddenly Dorne gets to join the realm on incredibly favorable terms. They got to keep their royal title, maintain their own laws, collect their own taxes, basically everything the other kingdoms didn't have. And to make matters worse, Dornishmen were flooding King's Landing, taking up positions at court and in the government. You can imagine how well that went over with the traditional enemies of Dorne, particularly the Lords of the Reach and the Stormlands. Second, there were those legitimacy questions I mentioned. Daeron didn't look like a typical Targaryen. His son Baelor looked more Dornish than Valyrian. Meanwhile, Daemon Blackfyre looked like he stepped right out of a Targaryen painting, all platinum blonde hair and purple eyes. Add to that the fact that Aegon had publicly given him the Sword of Kings, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Third, Daemon himself was deeply unhappy. He resented his bastard status. He had fallen in love with his half-sister Daenerys, but Daeron married her off to the Prince of Dorne as part of his peace deal. That personal slight, combined with political pressure from ambitious lords who saw an opportunity, slowly pushed Daemon toward rebellion. For 11 years after Aegon's death, there was an uneasy peace. Daeron tried to keep Daemon close, even paying the dowry his father had promised to marry Daemon off to Rohan of Tyrosh. But resentment was building. Lords who disagreed with the Dornish peace sought out Daemon. Warriors who felt that Daeron was too bookish and not martial enough whispered in his ear. And eventually, without any single dramatic incident triggering it, Daemon declared himself the true king of Westeros. The first Blackfyre Rebellion had begun in 196 AC, and it would last for nearly a year. Here's something that really drives home how serious this was. The rebellion literally split the realm in half. Now, technically, all of the great houses remain loyal to King Daeron. The Starks, the Aarons, the Lannisters, they all back the legitimate king. But that's not the whole story. Within each kingdom, major noble houses defied their overlords and joined Daemon. In the Reach, powerful houses threw their support behind the Blackfyre pretender. In the Stormlands, traditional enemies of Dorne flocked to Daemon's banners. In the Riverlands and the Westerlands, houses divided against each other. This wasn't just a royal dispute, it was a civil war that turned neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. At one point, Daemon's rebellion was so successful that he actually started minting his own coins. Think about what that means. He wasn't just rebelling, he was functioning as a legitimate king with his own economy. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Redgrass Field in late 186 AC. This is where we really need to pay attention, because this battle exemplifies just how brutal and personal this conflict was. Daemon's rebel army was approaching King's Landing itself. If he won this battle, he would take the throne. The royal army was commanded by Prince Baelor Breakspear, Daeron's eldest son and one of the greatest knights in the realm, and by Prince Maekar, Daeron's fourth son. But the key player was Brynden Rivers, better known as Bloodraven, another of Aegon's bastard sons and Daemon's half-brother. Daemon Blackfyre fought like the legendary warrior he was. He broke through Lord Aeron's vanguard, personally killing Will Waynwood and the Knight of Nine Stars. He severely wounded Sir Gawain Corbray of the King's Guard. When the battle reached its peak, Daemon and his twin sons, Aegon and Aemon, were protecting fallen enemies, showing the kind of knightly honor that made Daemon so beloved. And that's when Bloodraven, commanding the archers called the Raven's Teeth, made his move. He ordered his men to fire on Daemon. The first volley didn't kill him, but when Daemon rushed to his fallen son, Bloodraven personally put 7 arrows into him. When young Aemon tried to lift the legendary sword Blackfyre from his father's dying hands, Bloodraven shot him too. Let's pause here and think about what just happened. This wasn't an enemy killing an enemy. This was brother killing brother. Half siblings, all children of the same terrible king, murdering each other on a battlefield while tens of thousands of others died around them. The Battle of Redgrass Field claimed approximately 10,000 lives. That's just one battle. Daemon Blackfyre died there, along with his 2 eldest sons. But here's the crucial difference from the Dance of Dragons. The rebellion didn't end. Aegor Rivers, called Bittersteel, another of Daemon's half-brothers and one of his staunchest supporters, managed to escape with the sword Blackfyre and 5 of Daemon's surviving sons. They fled to the Free Cities, to Tyrosh, where Daemon's widow, Rohan, had family connections. And this is where the Blackfyre Rebellion becomes something far more insidious than the Dance of Dragons ever was. The dance ended when both claimants died. Yes, there were lasting consequences, but the immediate conflict was over. The Blackfyre Rebellion, that was just the beginning. Bittersteel formed the Golden Company, a sellsword company composed of exiled lords and knights who had lost everything supporting Daemon. Their company words became "Beneath the Gold, the Bitter Steel," and their mission was singular: to seat a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne. Let's talk about what happened next, because this is where it gets really interesting. In 211 AC, just 15 years after the first rebellion, Daemon's second son, also named Daemon, attempted to launch the second Blackfyre Rebellion. He disguised himself as a wandering knight called John the Fiddler and gathered supporters under the pretense of a wedding tourney at White Walls. But Bloodraven, now serving as hand of the king, discovered the plot and crushed it before it could really begin. Daemon II was captured, and Bloodraven faced a difficult choice. If he executed Daemon, Bittersteel would simply crown the next brother, Aegon, so he kept Daemon imprisoned, hoping that would prevent another uprising. It didn't work. In 219 AC, after Daemon II died in captivity, Bittersteel crowned Aegon as the new Blackfyre king and launched the third Blackfyre Rebellion. This one actually saw significant fighting. Prince Maekar Targaryen, who had fought at Redgrass Field, took the field again, this time alongside 2 of his sons. Bloodraven once again fought his half-brother Bittersteel in personal combat. The rebellion failed, Aegon was killed, and Bittersteel was captured. But somehow, the old warrior escaped and made it back to the Golden Company. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Every time the Targaryens thought they had ended the Blackfyre threat, it came roaring back. This wasn't like the Dance of Dragons, where the conflict burned hot and fast and then extinguished itself. This was a slow burn that refused to go out, constantly reigniting and consuming resources, lives, and political stability for generations. The Fourth Blackfyre Rebellion came in 236 AC, led by Daemon III, grandson of the original Daemon. By this point, you'd think the Blackfyre cause would have lost its appeal, right? The original Daemon had been dead for 40 years. The glory days of the First Rebellion were ancient history, but here they came again, landing at Massey's Hook with the Golden Company. King Aegon V himself rode out to face them with his 3 sons. The rebellion failed spectacularly. People had stopped believing in the Blackfyre cause. Daemon III was killed at the Battle of Wendwater Bridge by Sir Duncan the Tall. Bittersteel, now an old man, retreated back to Essos one final time. He died a few years later, still in exile, still clinging to the dream of a Blackfyre restoration, with a sword in his hand and defiance on his lips. But even Bittersteel's death didn't end it. In 260 AC, nearly 6.5 decades after the First Rebellion began, Maelys Blackfyre, called Maelys the Monstrous, launched the 5th and final Blackfyre Rebellion. Maelys was a terrifying figure, monstrously large with a second head growing from his neck, the remnant of a twin he had absorbed in the womb. The exact nature of his relationship to the original Daemon is unclear, but he had killed his own cousin, another demon, Blackfyre, to take leadership of the cause. This final rebellion was part of the War of the Nine Penny Kings, where 9 ambitious men tried to carve up kingdoms for themselves. Maelys and the Golden Company took the Stepstones and were preparing to invade Westeros when the assembled forces of the 7 kingdoms met them in battle. And it was there, on those rocky islands, that a young knight named Barristan Selmy killed Maelys in single combat, finally, definitively ending the male line of House Blackfyre. 64 years, 5 separate rebellions, countless thousands dead, political instability that lasted 3 generations. Now let's compare this to the Dance of Dragons, because that's what we're really here to discuss. The Dance of Dragons lasted approximately 2 years, from 129 to 131 AC. It was absolutely devastating, don't get me wrong. Both rival monarchs died, Rhaenyra and Aegon II. 17 dragons were killed, nearly wiping out these magnificent creatures entirely. Major houses were decimated. The small folk suffered terribly. It was a war fought in the air, on water, and on land, with battles like Rook's Rest and the storming of the Dragon Pit becoming legendary for their brutality. But here's the key difference. When it ended, it was over. Aegon III, Rhaenyra's son, took the throne. There was no Exile faction plotting to return. There were no dragon riders in Essos gathering supporters for a restoration. The consequences were severe. Yes, the loss of the dragons fundamentally changed Targaryen power, but the actual fighting stopped. The realm could begin to heal. The Blackfyre Rebellions never allowed that healing. Every time a new generation came of age, every time people started to forget, the Golden Company would appear on the horizon with another Blackfyre pretender. The psychological impact on Westeros was immense. The Targaryens became paranoid. Bloodraven created a spy network that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Anyone suspected of Blackfyre sympathies faced brutal consequences. This created a cycle where harsh crackdowns bred resentment, which kept anti-Targaryen sentiment alive, which justified more crackdowns. Let's talk numbers for a moment because this is important for understanding scale. The Battle of Redgrass Field alone killed 10,000 men. That's just the climactic battle of the First Rebellion. We don't have exact casualty figures for all 5 rebellions, but considering that each one involved significant military campaigns, sieges, and battles across multiple kingdoms, we're easily looking at tens of thousands of deaths across a 64-year period. Add to that the economic devastation. Every time a rebellion sparked, lords had to raise armies, which meant pulling farmers from their fields. Trade routes were disrupted. Castles were besieged. Small folk caught in the middle suffered terribly. The Dance of Dragons was more concentrated in its destruction. Those dragon battles were apocalyptic in their immediate impact. when Vagar and Caraxes fought above the God's Eye, when Sunfire and Melees clashed at Rook's Rest, when dragons attacked the Dragon Pit, the devastation was immense and visible. The psychological impact of seeing dragons, symbols of Targaryen power, killing each other in the sky was profound, but it was contained to roughly 2 years of intense warfare. Now, let's consider the political ramifications. The Dance of Dragons actually settled a major constitutional question. It established that male primogeniture would govern Targaryen succession. It wasn't the outcome everyone wanted, but it was a clear precedent. Future succession crises could point to the dance as establishing the rule. The Blackfyre Rebellions, on the other hand, left nothing resolved. They created a permanent question mark over legitimacy. Every time a Targaryen king was weak or unpopular, whispers would start. What if the Blackfyres were right? What if Daemon should have been king? The very existence of the Golden Company, a powerful military force explicitly dedicated to destroying the Targaryens, meant that there was always an external threat waiting to exploit any internal weakness. Here's something really interesting that often gets overlooked. The Blackfyre Rebellions fundamentally changed how Westeros viewed bastards with royal blood. Before the rebellions, legitimizing a bastard was seen as a generous act. After, it became political poison. In the books, when Catelyn Stark hears that Robb wants to legitimize Jon Snow and make him his heir, she's horrified. She explicitly references the Blackfyre Rebellions as a cautionary tale. 5 generations of war, murder, and grief, all because one king legitimized his bastards. That fear, that institutional memory, lasted for centuries. The Dance of Dragons didn't create that kind of lasting legal or social change. Let's also talk about the foreign policy implications. The Blackfyre Rebellions gave the Free Cities, particularly Tyrosh and Myr, enormous leverage over Westeros. They could threaten to support the next Blackfyre pretender anytime they wanted concessions from the Iron Throne. The Golden Company became one of the most formidable military forces in the known world, and they were explicitly anti-Targaryen. This meant that any Westerosi conflict had the potential to draw in foreign powers. The Dance of Dragons was purely an internal affair. Yes, it weakened the Targaryens, but it didn't create permanent external enemies the way the Blackfyre Rebellions did. And we need to talk about the dragons, because this is where the dance seems worse at first glance. Losing 17 dragons was catastrophic for House Targaryen. These weren't just weapons, they were symbols of legitimacy, living proof of Targaryen exceptionalism. After the dance, only 4 sickly dragons remained, and they eventually died out entirely. Within a few generations, the Targaryens were just another royal house, albeit one with a strong historical claim and some lingering mystique. That's enormous. But here's the counter-argument. The dragons were already becoming a problem. They were weapons of mass destruction that made any conflict exponentially more deadly. Imagine if the Blackfyre Rebellions had been fought with dragons on both sides. The devastation would have been unthinkable. In a weird way, the Dance of Dragons removing dragons from the equation might have actually saved Westeros from even worse conflicts down the line. The Blackfyre Rebellions had a different kind of cost. They cost the realm its stability. They created a permanent anxiety, a sense that any peace was temporary, that war could erupt again at any moment. They consumed enormous resources that could have been spent on infrastructure, trade, or defense against external threats. They forced the Targaryens to maintain large standing forces and an extensive spy network. They corrupted the government with paranoia and suspicion. That's a different kind of damage, not as dramatic as dragon battles, but arguably more corrosive over time. Let's consider some specific examples of how the Blackfyre Rebellions poisoned Westerosi politics for generations. Take House Peak, once a proud and powerful house of the Reach with 3 castles. After supporting Daemon in the first rebellion, they were reduced to a single castle. That kind of punishment bred lasting resentment. Or House Osgrey, reduced from castle holders to landed knights. These families didn't just lose the war, they lost their status, their wealth, and their futures. And they never forgot. Their descendants grew up on stories of past glories and unjust treatment. When the next rebellion came, guess who was ready to support it? Or look at what happened to Lord Aenys Blackfyre during the Great Council of 233 AC. He was promised safe conduct to King's Landing to present his claim to the throne. Bloodraven promised him safety, and the moment Aenys arrived, he was seized and executed. His head was presented to the lords as a warning. Now, strategically, Bloodraven probably made the right call. Aenys was a threat that needed to be eliminated, but politically and morally, this was a violation of sacred hospitality laws. It was a promise broken by the hand of the king himself. You can't do something like that without consequences. It reinforced the idea that the Targaryens were willing to do anything, break any rule, to maintain power. That's not the kind of precedent you want to set. The Dance of Dragons had its own atrocities, absolutely. Rhaenyra's brutal taxation of King's Landing, blood and cheese killing young Prince Jaehaerys, the storming of the dragon pit where the mob killed several dragons, Rhaenyra's eventual execution by dragon in front of her son. These were horrific events that traumatized the realm, but they were all contained within a relatively brief period. The trauma was intense but finite. The Blackfyre trauma never ended. It was like a wound that kept being reopened just as it started to heal. Here's another angle to consider. The Dance of Dragons was a war about succession and gender politics. It raised important questions about whether a woman could rule, about what it means to be a rightful heir, about the balance between martial prowess and diplomatic skill. These are complex, interesting questions, even if the war to answer them was brutal. The Blackfyre Rebellions, especially the later ones, weren't really about anything. The 4th and 5th rebellions weren't ideological struggles or attempts to address legitimate grievances. They were just ambitious men with a famous name trying to seize power because their great-grandfather once had a claim. That makes the suffering and death feel even more pointless. But let's be fair and consider the counter-arguments. The Dance of Dragons killed more people in a shorter time. Concentration of suffering matters. Those dragon battles were uniquely terrible. There's never been anything quite like dragons fighting each other in warfare. The psychological trauma of watching these godlike creatures destroy each other had to be immense. The dance also came close to completely destroying House Targaryen. Both claimants died, along with most of their immediate families. If things had gone slightly differently, the Targaryen dynasty could have ended entirely in 131 AC. The Blackfyres never really came that close to total victory. Moreover, the Dance of Dragons destroyed Targaryen unity in a way that could never be repaired. Before the dance, House Targaryen was special, united, above normal politics. After, they had proven they would kill each other for power just like any other house. That mystique, that sense of Targaryen exceptionalism, was shattered. The Blackfyre Rebellions didn't do that. They were external threats, bastards trying to usurp legitimate kings. The Targaryens could still claim they were the rightful dynasty defending itself. So after all of this analysis, after comparing the two conflicts across multiple dimensions, time spans, casualties, political impacts, economic costs, and psychological trauma, which was worse? Here's my take. The Dance of Dragons was more intensely destructive in the moment. It was a holocaust of fire and blood concentrated into 2 terrible years. The loss of the dragons was an irreplaceable strategic and symbolic blow. The immediate suffering was probably greater, but the Blackfyre Rebellions were worse in the long run. They created a permanent instability that lasted for 3 generations. They poisoned the political culture with paranoia and suspicion. They established terrible precedents about breaking oaths and crushing enemies without mercy. They drained resources and attention that could have been used to strengthen the realm. They gave foreign powers leverage over Westeros, and they created an institutional memory that made every future succession crisis more dangerous. Think about it this way. The Dance of Dragons was like a massive heart attack, terrifying, life-threatening, but once you survive it, you can recover and move on. The Blackfyre Rebellions were like a chronic disease, constantly flaring up, slowly weakening you over decades, never quite killing you, but never letting you be healthy either. Both are terrible, but that chronic condition might ultimately do more damage. The real genius of George R.R. Martin's world building is that he doesn't give us easy answers. He presents these complex historical events with multiple perspectives and lets us struggle with the questions. Was Daemon right to rebel if he genuinely believed he was the rightful heir? Were the Targaryens justified in their brutal crackdowns if they were defending legitimate rule? When does punishing rebels cross the line into creating new rebels? These aren't just fantasy questions. They're the same questions real history forces us to confront. What makes the Blackfyre story particularly tragic is how unnecessary it all became. The first rebellion had some legitimacy to it. Daemon was a remarkable man, possibly more qualified to rule than Daeron in some ways. And there were genuine grievances about Dornish influence. But by the time we get to Melees, the monstrous in 260 AC, it's just repetition. It's people dying for a cause that lost any real meaning decades earlier, killed by institutional inertia, and the inability of either side to break the cycle. The Dance of Dragons at least had the virtue of being decisive. Terrible, yes, but decisive. When it ended, everyone knew where they stood. The Blackfyre Rebellions never achieved that clarity. They just kept happening until one side was literally extinct. That's 64 years of recurring warfare when the realm should have been healing and growing stronger. Imagine what the Seven Kingdoms could have accomplished if all that energy, all those resources, all those lives had been directed towards something constructive instead of 5 doomed rebellions. In conclusion, if I had to choose which conflict was worse for Westeros, I'd say the Blackfyre Rebellions, but not by as much as you might think. The dance was more immediately catastrophic, but the Blackfyres created longer lasting damage. However, here's the real answer. They were both disasters that should serve as warnings about the dangers of succession crises and civil war. The specifics of which was worse matter less than understanding how both conflicts show us the terrible price of political instability and family division. The Targaryens survived both conflicts, but they were fundamentally weakened by each. The Dance took their dragons, the Blackfyres took their sense of security and forced them to become paranoid tyrants at times. Together, these conflicts set the stage for the eventual Targaryen downfall that we see in the main Game of Thrones story. Robert's rebellion succeeded where the Blackfyres failed, partly because the Targaryens had been so weakened by centuries of internal conflict. So what do you think? Was the concentrated horror of the Dance of Dragons worse? Or was it the slow, grinding trauma of 5 Blackfyre rebellions? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Westeros history, make sure to like and subscribe. There are so many more fascinating stories to explore in this world, and I can't wait to discuss them with you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.